A poor girl saves a man at the foot of the mountain, unaware he's a billionaire, and it changes her life forever. The wind howled through the valley, carrying the sharp sting of winter. Snowflakes spun in the air like tiny blades, slicing into Emily Dawson's exposed cheeks as she pushed through the thick snow. Her boots sank deep with every step. The sky hung low and gray, the kind that warned of an oncoming blizzard. She pulled her worn coat tighter around herself, cursing the cold that crept into her bones. Emily had gone farther from her cabin than usual, desperate to gather enough firewood before nightfall. The forest at the mountain's base was eerily quiet, save for the occasional groan of wind pushing through the towering pines. She adjusted the axe slung across her back, her breath forming little clouds in the freezing air. Then she heard it. A faint sound, almost lost in the wind, a low, painful moan. Emily froze, her pulse quickening. At first she thought she'd imagined it, but there it was again, a soft, pain-filled groan. Her eyes swept across the snowy landscape. The sound was nearby, but the wind screamed through the trees, making it hard to tell where it was coming from. "Hello?" she called out, her voice uncertain. No answer. She hesitated only a moment before pressing on, instincts flaring. Someone was in trouble. Her boots crunched against the icy snow as she moved forward. Then, beneath the thick white layer covering the ground, she spotted something strange, a dark shape barely visible under a mound of snow. Her heart jumped. She rushed forward, dropped to her knees beside it, and brushed away the snow. Her breath caught. There was a man. His face was pale, dark hair frozen at the edges, and his fine clothes were torn and soaked through. His lips were nearly blue, his eyes half closed. "Hey, can you hear me?" Emily shook his shoulder. He barely moved. "Sir, wake up!" A weak groan slipped from his lips. His fingers twitched, fighting the deadly cold. Emily leaned closer. "You have to wake up. If you stay out here, you'll die." His lips parted. She thought he might speak, but only a hoarse whisper came out. "Help!" Emily clenched her jaw, quickly scanning the situation. His leg was twisted badly, blood staining the snow. A broken leg. In this weather. He wouldn't last long. Cursing under her breath, she grabbed his arm and tried to lift him. He was heavier than she expected, dead weight in the snow. "Come on," she gritted her teeth, shifting his arm over her shoulder. "I'm not leaving you here." With every ounce of strength, she heaved him up, stumbling under his weight. Each step was a fight, against the deep snow, the biting wind tearing through her coat. The man groaned in pain as she dragged him forward, his head slumping against her shoulder. She didn't know who he was or how he ended up here, but none of that mattered now. All that mattered was getting him home, before the cold took him for good. Emily staggered through the thick snow, arms locked around the unconscious man as she pulled him toward her cabin. The cold was merciless, slicing through her coat and numbing her limbs. Still, she didn't stop. His breathing was shallow, his body limp. She wouldn't let him die. By the time they reached the cabin, every muscle in her body screamed with exhaustion. She kicked open the door, nearly falling as she dragged him inside. Warmth hit them like a wave, the fire in the hearth crackling gently, casting flickering shadows on the wooden walls. With great effort, she eased him onto the old couch near the fire. His body was ice cold, his fingers stiff from frostbite. Emily grabbed blankets and wrapped them around him, then knelt beside him to check his injuries. His face was hollow, his features sharp even in sleep. His expensive coat was torn, stiff with frozen blood. Her eyes locked on his leg. A deep gash ran along his shin, red and angry against pale skin. She swore softly. If it got infected. She worked fast, her hands steady despite the urgency. She cleaned the wound with warm water, wincing at the sight. He stirred, letting out a faint groan, but didn't wake. After bandaging his leg tightly, she exhaled slowly. Now, all she could do was wait. Hours passed. Emily sat in a creaky wooden chair across from the couch, watching him closely. His breathing steadied. The color returned to his face. Firelight danced across his features, revealing the rough stubble on his jaw and the strong angles of his face. He didn't look like a local. Who was he? And what was he doing in the middle of nowhere? Just as questions swirled in her mind, a hoarse voice broke the silence. "Where am I?" Emily sprang up and moved closer. His eyelids fluttered open, revealing stormy gray eyes scanning the room. "You're in my cabin," she said, her voice firm yet calm. "I found you, half dead in the snow." He groaned softly. His hand moved to his temple, as if trying to piece together scattered thoughts. I don't remember," he murmured. Emily narrowed her eyes. "What's your name?" He blinked against the flickering firelight. After a long pause, he rasped, "Richard." Richard Caldwell. The name stirred something faint in Emily's memory, but she couldn't quite place it. "You were in rough shape when I found you," she said, arms crossed. "Your leg was badly injured. You had no supplies, no proper gear. What happened to you?" Richard let out a sharp breath, trying to sit up. Pain flashed across his face as he grabbed at his bandaged leg. I don't know," he said, frustrated. "I remember the cold, the storm, then nothing. It's all a blur." Emily studied him closely. She couldn't tell if he was hiding something or just confused. Either way, something about his story didn't sit right with her. Then, his expression changed. Confusion gave way to alarm. "My phone," he muttered, patting the pockets of his torn coat. "My wallet?" "Where the hell?" Emily's stomach tightened. "They weren't on you when I found you." Richard's jaw clenched. No, I had them. I remember. My phone, my wallet, my watch. They're gone." A heavy silence fell between them. Emily had seen enough in life to know what that meant. Someone had taken his things. And out here in the unforgiving Alaskan wilderness, that kind of thing didn't just happen by accident. "You think someone robbed you?" she asked, keeping her voice calm. Richard let out a bitter laugh. "Seems like the only explanation, doesn't it?" Emily frowned. If someone had left him out there to die, that meant someone had wanted him gone. But why? She glanced toward the fire, the flames dancing quietly, as if reflecting her thoughts. Richard Caldwell? Expensive clothes, sharp eyes, no memory of how he ended up half frozen on the mountain. It didn't add up. And yet, despite the unease curling in her stomach, she couldn't bring herself to turn him away. Not yet. The morning light filtered through frosted window panes, casting a pale glow over the little wooden cabin. The fire had burned low, leaving behind soft, crackling embers. Emily moved about with practiced ease, adding wood to the stove and setting a kettle over the flame. The air smelled of pine and a faint trace of smoked meat, humble but familiar. Behind her, the sound of rustling blankets made her turn. Richard was stirring, his movements stiff. He winced as he adjusted his injured leg. His face was still pale with exhaustion, but his gray eyes were more alert than they'd been the night before. "You're awake," Emily said, setting down the tin cup she'd been holding. He gave a small nod, running a hand down his face as if trying to wipe away a lingering nightmare. "Yeah. Guess I owe you a thank you for not leaving me out there." Emily scoffed, pouring hot water into the cup and walking over to him. "You'd be frozen solid if I had." She handed him the cup. "Drink. It'll help warm you up." Richard took it cautiously, eyeing the steaming liquid. "What is it?" "Pine needle tea," she replied with a smirk, catching his doubtful look. "You don't have many options, city boy. It's either that or freeze." At the words city boy, Richard gave her a bemused glance but said nothing. He lifted the cup to his lips, grimacing at the bitter taste. But he drank. Just then, the door creaked open. An elderly woman stepped inside, wrapped in thick furs. Her sharp blue eyes landed on Richard with a pointed, calculating gaze. "So this is the stranger you dragged in from the snow," she said, her voice lined with curiosity and doubt. Emily straightened. "Grandma, this is Richard. Richard, this is Martha Dawson." Richard nodded, attempting to sit a little straighter. "Ma'am." Martha gave a quiet hum and stepped closer, examining him with a critical eye before turning to Emily. "He shouldn't be here." Emily folded her arms. "I couldn't just leave him to die." Martha sighed, untying the fur-lined hood from around her face. "You're too soft-hearted, child. Strangers mean trouble." Emily clenched her jaw but said nothing. She knew her grandmother wasn't heartless, just cautious. Life in Alaska had made her that way. Still, Emily had made her choice. "He'll stay. Until he's strong enough to leave," she said firmly. Martha exhaled through her nose, clearly not convinced, but she didn't argue. Instead, she moved to the stove and began preparing breakfast, each motion slow and precise. Richard watched them silently. His gaze drifted around the cabin, shelves lined with jars of preserved food, bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, a few old hunting rifles resting by the door, their wooden stocks worn smooth with time. Despite its simplicity, the cabin was warm, both in temperature and in the quiet bond shared between granddaughter and grandmother. The smell of food filled the air. Richard's stomach twisted painfully. He hadn't realized how hungry he was until now. Emily caught the look on his face and smirked. "Haven't eaten in a while, have you?" He frowned. "Not since... I don't actually remember." "Well, you're in luck. Breakfast is almost ready." Minutes later, Martha set down 3 wooden bowls on the table. Inside was a thick stew made from dried venison, root vegetables, and wild herbs. It wasn't fancy, just simple rustic food, but it smelled good. Richard hesitated, then picked up the wooden spoon and took a bite. The stew was hot, rich with earthy flavors of slow-cooked meat and foraged seasonings. It was unlike anything he'd ever eaten before, nothing like the refined meals from 5-star restaurants or the processed food of city life. This was real, unpretentious, nourishing in a way that had nothing to do with wealth. He glanced at Emily, who ate with the same quiet efficiency she seemed to apply to everything. "You live like this every day?" he asked after a moment. Emily looked up. "Like what?" "Hunting for food, making your own medicine, chopping wood just to stay warm." She shrugged. "Yeah, it's not easy, but it's life." Richard shook his head, stirring his stew absent-mindedly. "I don't think I've ever had to work that hard for anything." Martha snorted. "Doesn't surprise me." Richard chuckled softly. "I bet." Emily watched him for a beat. There was something odd about seeing a man who clearly came from wealth sitting at their modest table, eating their humble food. He was completely out of place, and yet, the way he looked at his bowl, like he was reevaluating everything he'd ever known, made her wonder. Maybe he wasn't as lost as he seemed. The days passed slowly in the Dawson cabin, marked by the steady crackle of the fire and the distant howling of the wind. Richard's strength was returning, though his injured leg still kept him from moving much. Despite the pain, he found a strange peace in the quiet rhythm of the place. Emily was always busy, chopping wood, checking traps, preparing meals, caring for her grandmother. She never complained, never hesitated. Richard had never met anyone like her. One evening, as the fire flickered warmly in the hearth, Richard sat up on the couch, stretching his sore limbs. Emily sat at the table, carefully stitching a tear in her coat. The room smelled of pine and smoke, scents that were quickly becoming associated with safety in his mind. "I need to tell you something," he said, breaking the silence. Emily didn't look up. You're not secretly a murderer, are you? Richard laughed. But I am rich. That made her glance up, one eyebrow raised. He exhaled, running a hand through his dark hair. My full name is Richard Caldwell. I own a company, Caldwell Enterprises. We do real estate and private investments. I've got offices in New York, London, Tokyo. Emily blinked. Okay. Richard waited. He expected shock, curiosity, something. But she just shrugged and went back to sewing. That's it? He asked, incredulous. She didn't even look at him. What do you want me to say? I don't know, he said, gesturing vaguely. Most people would be a little more surprised. Emily tied off the thread and bit it with her teeth. Then she finally met his eyes. It doesn't change anything. The morning air was crisp and biting, thick with the scent of pine and fresh snow. Richard stepped outside, leaning against the railing as he took in the vast expanse of wilderness before him. Towering mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks frosted white, untouched by time. Richard stared, baffled. You're telling me you don't care at all? She sighed and leaned back in her chair. Look, Richard, maybe in your world, money means everything. But out here, it won't light a fire. It won't feed you. And it sure as hell won't save you when you're half dead in a snowstorm. Richard opened his mouth, but she kept going. Out there, maybe you're some big-shot millionaire? She nodded toward the world beyond the cabin walls. But here, you're just a guy who got lost in the snow. The words hit harder than he expected. His whole life, people had treated him differently because of his wealth. His employees, his so-called friends, even the women he dated. He lived in a world where money meant power, where his name alone commanded respect. But Emily didn't care. Not even a little. For the first time in his life, Richard felt something unfamiliar. Humility. He leaned back, staring into the fire as his thoughts tangled. Emily stood and stretched. I'm going to bed. Try not to overthink it too much, city boy. Richard watched her disappear into the small adjoining room, leaving him alone. And for the first time, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, he'd been living his whole life wrong. It was unlike anything he'd ever seen in New York. This wasn't a world built for men in suits. It belonged to the earth itself. Emily appeared from the side of the cabin, an old axe slung over her shoulder. She gave him a quick glance, then looked at the dwindling firewood pile near the door. If you're going to stand there all day, at least make yourself useful, she said, tossing him a pair of gloves. Richard barely caught them before they hit his chest. Chopping wood? Really? Emily smirked. Unless you'd rather freeze tonight. Richard sighed and pulled on the gloves. He'd spent his life making money. Now it looked like he'd have to learn how to make fire. Billion-dollar deals, managing entire companies. Richard had done it all, but he had never chopped a single piece of firewood. As he followed Emily to the clearing behind the cabin, he realized something strange. For the first time, he wanted to try. At first, he was terrible. The axe was heavier than he expected, and every time he brought it down, the logs barely split. Emily stood nearby, arms crossed, barely hiding a grin. You don't have to hit it like it insulted your stock portfolio, she teased. Richard groaned, wiping sweat from his brow. Maybe you should just do it. Nope, she said, stepping closer. Here, adjust your grip. Stand like this. She positioned his hands over the wooden handle and guided him into a better stance. Her fingers were calloused but warm, steadying his movement. Richard found himself momentarily distracted by her nearness, the way sunlight caught the wind-tousled strands of her hair. Now try again, she said. He swallowed and focused. This time, when he swung the axe, the log split cleanly in two. Emily grinned. There you go. Richard stared at the broken pieces, a flicker of satisfaction stirring in his chest. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. Maybe there was something to this whole working with your hands thing after all. Days passed, and Richard began to adapt. He helped Emily with small tasks, fetching water from the frozen stream, patching the leaky roof, even setting snares in the forest. His suit and tie were long gone, replaced by thick wool clothes borrowed from Emily's grandfather's old trunk. His hands, once only used for signing contracts, were rough now, worn from real labor, and strangely, he didn't hate it. One evening, as they sat near the fire, Emily handed him a bow. "You're going to teach me how to hunt now?" Richard asked, raising an eyebrow. Emily smirked. "You want to eat, don't you?" He sighed, shaking his head. "Fine, but if I die doing this, you're telling my board of directors it was your fault." She laughed. The next morning, they moved carefully through the woods. The air was crisp with the sharp scent of pine. Richard tried to step lightly, mimicking Emily, but she was like a ghost, silent and precise. He, on the other hand, stepped on every damn twig in his path. They tracked a rabbit for nearly an hour. Finally, Emily nudged him. "All right, city boy, take your shot." Richard hesitated, gripping the bow. The rabbit twitched its ears, sensing something. "You hesitate, you lose," Emily whispered. He exhaled and let the arrow fly. It missed by a mile. Emily winced. "Okay, that was painful to watch." Richard groaned. "Maybe I should stick to real estate," she laughed. "Come on, we'll try again later." That afternoon, as they made their way back toward the cabin, something shifted in the air. The birds stopped chirping. The wind stilled. Emily froze. Richard frowned. "What is it?" A deep, guttural growl rumbled through the trees. Richard's blood turned to ice. He slowly turned his head, just in time to see a massive grizzly bear emerge from the underbrush. Its eyes locked onto them, its muscles tensing. It was close, too close, and enormous. Richard couldn't move. He had never known fear like this. Emily acted first. "Slowly move back," she whispered. Richard obeyed, heart pounding. The bear huffed and stepped forward. Its paws crunched the snow. Then, suddenly, it charged. Richard barely had time to react. Emily grabbed his arm and shoved him behind a tree. In one smooth motion, she raised her rifle and fired a shot into the air. The crack echoed through the forest. The bear skidded to a stop, ears flattening. It hesitated, then huffed again and turned, lumbering back into the woods. Richard pressed himself against the tree, hands shaking, breath ragged. Emily lowered the rifle, exhaling slowly. "That," Richard panted, "was the single most terrifying thing I've ever experienced." Emily slung the rifle over her shoulder and smirked. "Welcome to Alaska." Richard let out a breathless laugh, still trying to steady his nerves. But something had changed. Emily had risked her life for him. No hesitation, no second thoughts. And Richard knew deep down that no one had ever done that for him before. Not his business partners, not the women he'd dated, not even the people he called friends. But Emily, this woman who barely knew him, who had no reason to care, had. And in that moment, Richard Caldwell, Billionaire CEO, realized something profound. All the money in the world meant nothing compared to this. The fire crackled in the hearth, the only sound filling the cabin. Richard sat at the wooden table, staring at his hands. Outside, the wind howled against the walls, rattling the shutters, but he barely noticed. His mind was spinning, piecing together broken memories, trying to make sense of everything. Emily sat across from him, sipping tea, watching him. "You look like a man who just figured something out," she said finally. Richard exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "I think I know why I was out there, why I nearly died." Emily set her cup down. "Go on." He let out a slow breath. "Before I woke up in the snow, I was in Alaska for a business meeting. My company, Caldwell Enterprises, we were negotiating a deal to acquire a mining operation. A gold mine, to be exact. Emily's brow furrowed. A gold mine? Richard nodded. One of the last untouched reserves in the region. Billions of dollars in untapped resources. My company had been negotiating the purchase for months. Emily's expression darkened. Let me guess. The deal wasn't exactly clean. Richard hesitated. The truth was he'd never given much thought to the moral implications of his business deals. He had people for that. But now, sitting in this cabin, seeing the world through Emily's eyes, everything felt different. The negotiations were intense, he admitted. Not everyone wanted me to get control of the mine. There were other investors, competitors, people who stood to gain if I disappeared. Emily leaned forward. You think someone tried to get rid of you? Richard clenched his jaw. Not just someone. I think it was my own assistant. The realization hit like a gut punch. Jonathan Reed, his right hand, the man who handled his schedule, his travel, his security, the man Richard had trusted above anyone else, and the last person he'd seen before waking up in the snow. The memory returned in fractured flashes. A private meeting in a luxury lodge near Fairbanks. Jonathan standing by the fireplace, reviewing final documents. Everything is set, Jonathan had said, pouring Richard a drink. By this time tomorrow, the mine will be yours. Richard had taken the glass, nodding. Good. I don't want any surprises. Jonathan had smiled. Of course. You can always trust me. Then, darkness. A sharp pain in his skull, the bitter taste of something in his drink, and then ice, snow, blinding white. Richard's hands curled into fists. He must have drugged me, left me out there knowing I wouldn't survive. By the time they declared me missing, the deal would have been signed. Without me. Emily's expression hardened. So he tried to kill you. For money. Richard let out a bitter laugh. That's the world I come from? Emily shook her head, disgust flashing in her green eyes. Unbelievable. And to think you actually trusted this guy. I did, Richard said, voice low. He raked a hand through his hair, his jaw tight. But I can't let him get away with this. Emily studied him for a long moment. So what are you going to do? He looked up, gray eyes burning with a cold determination. I have to go back. A silence fell between them. Emily leaned back, arms crossed. Right. Of course. Go back to your world of power and money. Richard frowned. I don't have a choice. If I don't stop him, he'll take everything I've built. He'll win. Emily's lips pressed into a thin line. And then what? You fix your business, put the bad guy in jail, and go back to your fancy penthouse in New York? Richard hesitated. He hadn't thought that far ahead. All he knew was that he couldn't let this betrayal stand. But now, looking at Emily, at this life he'd come to respect, something unsettled twisted in his chest. Emily exhaled, shaking her head. Look, I get it. You have unfinished business. Just don't forget what you learned here. Richard met her gaze, and for the first time he realized he didn't want to leave. Not really. He reached across the table, his fingers brushing lightly against hers. I will come back. Emily looked at him, searching his face for any sign of doubt. Then she nodded just once. You better. And for the first time in his life, Richard Caldwell knew he had something worth coming back for. The day Richard left, the sky was a dull gray, thick clouds rolling in over the mountains like a heavy curtain. The air was colder than usual, or maybe it just felt that way to Emily as she stood outside the cabin, watching him prepare to leave. He was dressed in borrowed winter gear, bundled against the elements. But something about him already looked different, like he no longer belonged here. His injured leg had healed enough to travel, though he still walked with a slight limp. The sled dogs barked restlessly, eager to begin the journey. Emily crossed her arms, keeping her expression neutral. "You sure you're ready for this, city boy?" Richard smirked, though sadness lingered in his eyes. "I don't think I have a choice." She exhaled, her breath forming a white cloud in the air. "I guess not." Martha, standing a few feet away, gave Richard a hard look. "Be careful out there, boy. The world ain't as forgiving as this place." Richard nodded. "I know." He turned back to Emily, hesitating. There were a million things he wanted to say, but none of them felt right. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small. He pressed it into her hand. It was a silver compass, worn with age. Emily frowned. "What's this?" "My grandfather's," Richard said quietly. "He used to say it would always point him home." Emily looked up, meeting his gaze. "And where's home for you?" Richard hesitated. Then, softly, "I don't know yet." Emily swallowed hard, curling her fingers around the compass. "You better figure it out." A long silence stretched between them. Then, finally, Richard stepped back and climbed onto the sled. With a sharp command to the dogs, they lurched forward, kicking up a flurry of snow. Emily stood unmoving, watching as he disappeared into the trees and out of her world. The white horizon stretched endlessly, and for the first time since she was a child, Emily felt something strange, something that scared her more than any storm. She missed him. The weeks passed slowly. Emily threw herself into work, hunting, chopping wood, fixing whatever needed fixing. She told herself it didn't matter that Richard hadn't sent word. But every morning, her eyes drifted to the trail he had left on, and every night, she turned the small silver compass over in her fingers, as if it might hold an answer. Martha noticed, of course. "He's not coming back," her grandmother said one evening, stirring a pot of stew over the fire. Emily didn't look up. "I never said he was," Martha sighed, shaking her head. "You like him," Emily scoffed. "Doesn't matter if I do. He has his world. I have mine." Martha studied her in silence. Then, softly, "And what if his world isn't what he wants anymore?" Emily didn't have an answer, but one evening, everything changed. She was outside, stacking firewood, when she heard the distant sound of sled dogs. She turned, expecting one of the village traders. Instead, a man she had never seen before stepped off the sled. He was tall, dressed in a heavy fur-lined coat. His face was sharp, his posture stiff, like someone who didn't belong in these parts. He pulled something from his pocket, a sealed envelope. "Miss Dawson?" he asked. Emily nodded slowly. The man extended the letter. "This is from Richard Caldwell." Her heart slammed against her ribs. She hesitated, then took the envelope, the cold paper stiff in her hands. The man gave a small nod. "He's waiting for you." Richard hadn't forgotten her. And now, for the first time, it was her turn to decide where she belonged. Emily had never seen so many lights in her life. New York City stretched out before her like a living, breathing thing. Towering skyscrapers reached into the clouds. People streamed through the streets in an endless current. Horns honked. Billboards flashed. The energy was overwhelming. She tightened her grip on the silver compass in her pocket, her only tether to the life she'd left behind. The black car that picked her up from the airport wove through the chaos until it stopped in front of a gleaming hotel. The driver opened her door with a polite nod, but Emily barely noticed. She was too busy staring up at the massive glass building. "This is where Richard lives?" The elevator to the penthouse was silent, save for the quiet hum of the city below. Then the doors slid open. Richard was waiting. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. He looked different, dressed in a tailored suit, clean-shaven, every bit the billionaire he had been, but his eyes were softer. "Emily," he said, stepping forward. She swallowed, steadying herself. You wrote to me. He exhaled, nodding. I told you I'd come back. When I realized I couldn't, I knew. I had to bring you to me. She looked around the penthouse. Polished marble floors, floor-to-ceiling windows. The view stretched forever. This was a world she didn't belong to. Richard must have seen her hesitation. He stepped closer. I know it's a lot, he said gently. But I didn't bring you here to impress you. Then why did you bring me here? She asked, arms crossing. He took a slow breath. Because I needed you to see the man I used to be, and the man I'm trying to become. Over the next few days, Emily saw just how much Richard had changed. He had fired Jonathan Reed, pressed charges, and reclaimed control of his company. But more than that, he had started something new, a foundation, the Dawson Initiative. It's a nonprofit, Richard explained one night over dinner. For rural communities, especially places like Alaska, better infrastructure, medical aid, education, real lasting change. Emily blinked. You named it after me? Richard smiled. I wouldn't be here without you. She searched his face, looking for the lie, but there was none, just sincerity, real, undeniable sincerity. And then one night, as they walked the edge of Central Park, Richard finally said it. I love you, Emily. Her breath caught. He reached for her hands, his grip warm despite the cold. I don't care about anything else, not the money, not the company. I just want you. Her heart pounded, but she didn't speak right away. She had seen men like him before, men of power, men who made promises they didn't understand. And she wasn't going to be another beautiful thing in a penthouse museum. So she said, If you love me, Richard, then prove it. His brow furrowed. How? She pulled the compass from her pocket and held it up. Find your way home. Weeks passed. Emily returned to Alaska, unsure if he would follow. But he did. Not in a private jet, not in designer suits. He came as a man who wanted to learn. He spent months in the village working alongside her. He chopped wood, carried water, listened, helped. He even learned to hunt, though he was still terrible at it. And in that time, Emily saw the truth. This wasn't a game. This was love. He had changed. One evening, as they stood by the river watching the northern lights dance across the sky, Richard turned to her. Emily, he said, his voice steady. Can I stay? She looked at him, the man who had once been lost in a storm, who had been broken and betrayed, who had rebuilt himself not with money, but with something far greater. A man who had found his way home. She smiled, slipping her hand into his. Yeah, she whispered. You can stay. And as the lights shimmered above them, Emily knew. This was just the beginning. Richard found something far more valuable than wealth. He found purpose. He found love. He found a place to truly call home. Emily, the girl who once saved a stranger in the snow, had unknowingly saved a lost soul, searching for something he never knew he needed. Together they built a life that bridged two worlds, one of untamed wilderness and one of towering skyscrapers. But in the end, it wasn't the wealth or the power that mattered. It was the simple moments, the quiet love, the understanding that true riches come not from what we own, but from the people who stand beside us. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Soul-Stirring Stories for more heartfelt tales that inspire and uplift. Let us bring you more stories of love, resilience, and the unexpected beauty of human connection. Until next time, stay warm, stay hopeful, and always believe in the kindness of strangers.